Imagine you go to work on a Monday morning. You sit at your desk. You open a spreadsheet you have opened 100 times before. And somewhere inside those columns and numbers and rows of data, you find something. Something that was never meant to be found. Something that changes everything you thought you knew about the place you worked, the man you believed in, and the community you gave your life to serve. Now imagine that you do the right thing. You report it. You document it. You follow every rule, every channel, every process this country tells you to follow. And one by one, every door you knock on closes quietly in your face. Now imagine that 3 weeks later, you vanish. Your car is in the driveway. Your coffee is on the counter, still warm. Your daughters cannot reach you. And the officer who takes the missing persons report already knows the man you are about to expose. That is not a scene from a movie. That is the story of a woman we will call Renee Matthews. And before this video is over, you will understand exactly why she disappeared, and exactly why the people who could have stopped it chose not to. Stay with me from the very beginning to the very end, because the truth she left behind is something they never counted on. And it is something every one of us needs to hear. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one deserve to be heard, and we are committed to making sure they are. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened to Renee Matthews, you first have to understand who she was, where she came from, what she believed, and why, when she found the truth, she could not walk away from it, even when walking away might have saved her life. Renee Matthews grew up in a mid-sized city in the American South, the kind of place where the black community had built something real out of almost nothing. Churches on every corner, barbecue smoke drifting through the neighborhood on Friday evenings, grandmothers sitting on front porches, watching the children play, keeping count of everyone who belonged and everyone who did not. It was a tight-knit world, a world built on trust, on memory, on the understanding that you looked out for your neighbor because one day your neighbor would look out for you. And Renee was woven into the very fabric of it. She was the third of 5 children, raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry, and a father who drove a city bus for 31 years without missing a single day. They were not wealthy people, but they were proud people, and they instilled in Renee something that would follow her every single day of her life, a bone-deep belief that hard work and honesty could carry you anywhere, and that if you did right by your community would do right by you. Renee was the kind of student who stayed after class to ask questions, not because she was slow, but because she genuinely wanted to understand, not just the answer, but the reason behind the answer. Her teachers noticed it early. She had a mind that did not merely absorb information, it organized it, it cataloged it, it filed things away and came back to them later with sharper questions. She graduated from her local high school with honors, then went on to a regional university where she studied social work and public administration. Her professors later said she was one of the most diligent students they had ever taught, thorough, methodical, and deeply, personally committed to the communities that had been overlooked for generations. She was not studying to get a title or to climb a ladder. She was studying to go back home and fix something. After graduating, she did not chase money or prestige or the kind of career that looks impressive on paper but keeps you far from the people who need you most. She went home. She took a position at a small community outreach office, answering phones and processing paperwork for families applying for housing assistance. It was not glamorous work. There were no awards for it, no speeches, no recognition dinners. But it was meaningful work, and for Renee Matthews, meaningful, was everything. Over the next several years, she moved up slowly and steadily, the way people move up when they actually know what they are doing. She learned the system from the inside out. She understood grant cycles and federal funding requirements and compliance timelines and the particular bureaucratic language of government contracts. She became the kind of person that organizations could not function without, the one who knew where every file was, who remembered every deadline, and who always kept her receipts. And then, in the spring of what would become the most defining year of her life, Renee took a job at an organization we will call the Cornerstone Community Foundation. On paper, it was exactly the kind of place she had spent her whole career working toward. A nonprofit dedicated to serving low-income Black families in the region. Housing assistance, youth mentorship, senior programs, food distribution, job placement services, the works. It had been in operation for nearly 15 years. It had government contracts, it had private donors, it had the blessing of the local church leadership, the praise of city council members, and the genuine admiration of everyone in the community who had ever walked through its doors. To the outside world, the Cornerstone Community Foundation was one of the most trusted organizations in the city. And at the center of it all, the man who had built it from nothing, the man whose face appeared on every brochure and every press release and every framed photograph in the lobby, was a man we will call Director Gerald Aldridge. Gerald Aldridge was the kind of man that Black communities had been taught to admire. He dressed sharp. He spoke with authority. He moved through rooms like he was already the most important person in them. And somehow, without anyone quite deciding it consciously, everyone tended to agree. He had grown up in the same kind of neighborhood as Renee, which he never let anyone forget. He talked about poverty from personal experience. He quoted scripture at exactly the right moments. He gave speeches at community banquets that made grown men emotional and women rise from their seats in recognition. He was the local hero made real, the boy from the block who had risen up and was now giving back. Donors trusted him. Politicians stood beside him at ribbon cuttings. Pastors endorsed him from their pulpits. And when Renee Matthews joined the Cornerstone Community Foundation as its senior program coordinator, she trusted him too. She had no reason not to. She had every reason in the world to believe she had finally found the place where she could do the most good. For the first 2 years, that belief felt completely justified. The work felt genuine. She ran youth after-school programs that served dozens of children every week. She helped elderly residents navigate the paperwork maze of benefit applications that most people found impossible to handle alone. She organized food drives that served hundreds of families in the weeks before the holidays. She recruited volunteers from the local colleges. She stayed late when she had to and came in early when she needed to, giving more of herself to that organization than she had given to anything outside of her own family. Renee believed, with every fiber of her being, that what she was doing mattered, that the Cornerstone Community Foundation was a true lifeline for families who had nowhere else to turn, and that Gerald Aldridge was the man holding the rope. But something was always slightly off, something she could not name at first, a feeling more than a fact, a shadow at the edge of things that disappeared when she looked directly at it. A vendor invoice that arrived for services she did not recall authorizing. A grant disbursement going to a program name she had never seen on any official list. A staff meeting that got quietly cancelled the same week a large incoming check was expected to clear. She told herself she was being overly cautious. She had always been a detail-oriented person, and detail-oriented people sometimes see patterns where none exist. She filed the observations away in the back of her mind and kept doing her job. She kept showing up, She kept believing. She kept trusting. Then came year 3. And year 3 is where everything changed. It started, as so many devastating things do, with something completely ordinary. Renee had been assigned the task of preparing the organization's year-end program summary, a document required by one of their federal funders, accounting for how every dollar of a specific grant had been spent. She had done this kind of work before. She pulled the financial records from the shared server, opened her spreadsheet, and began what she expected to be a straightforward, line-by-line reconciliation. It was the kind of tedious, invisible, uncelebrated administrative work that nobody else wanted to do. And that invisibility, that quiet, thankless thoroughness that had defined her entire career, is exactly what allowed her to see what no one else had seen. The numbers did not add up, not by a small margin, by a significant, deliberate, and deeply troubling amount. A vendor listed as receiving payment for youth transportation services had no verifiable business registration in the state. A consulting firm appearing on 3 separate invoices totaling over $80,000 had no web presence, no phone number, and no address matching anything in the public state business registry. A single line item for community outreach materials had been charged against 4 completely different grants in the same fiscal quarter. The same expense, duplicated 4 times over, billed to 4 different funders simultaneously. Renee sat back in her chair and stared at her screen for a very long time. Then she printed everything out, put it in a folder, closed her office door quietly behind her, and took it home. That night, she called her closest friend, a woman we will call Diane Porter, who had known Renee since they were both in elementary school. Diane later told people close to the family that when she answered the phone that evening, Renee's voice was unlike anything she had ever heard before. Not panicked, not frightened, quiet, controlled. The kind of quiet that settles over a person when they have just understood something and the understanding has not yet fully landed. "Diane," she said, "I need you to come over. I found something, and I do not know exactly what to do with it yet." Diane drove over. She sat at Renee's kitchen table. She looked at the folder. She looked at the numbers. And then she looked at her friend. "Renee," she said slowly, "are you sure about this?" And Renee said, without hesitating for even a second, "I am always sure you know that about me." Over the following 3 weeks, Renee did not sleep well. She went to work every day, sat at her desk, smiled at her colleagues, attended staff meetings, made small talk in the break room, and said nothing. But at night, alone in her house, she kept digging. She cross-referenced grant disbursements against public state records. She pulled IRS filings from the foundation's publicly available tax documents. She mapped the money, tracking where it came in, where it went out, and what happened to it in between. And what she found, when she finally laid it all out on her living room floor and stepped back to look at the full picture, was something so clear and so calculated that she could barely bring herself to look at it directly. Over a period of approximately 5 years, Gerald Aldridge and his associates had taken somewhere in the range of $2 million, money earmarked for low-income black families, and funneled it through a network of fictitious vendors and shell accounts directly into their own pockets. The families who were supposed to receive housing assistance never saw it. The youth programs that were supposed to be funded quietly shrank year after year. The seniors who were supposed to get services went without, and the man whose face was on every brochure in the lobby continued to collect community awards and give speeches about the transformative power of giving back. Renee Matthews was not a lawyer. She was not a federal investigator or a journalist or a prosecutor. She was a woman with a spreadsheet, a printer, and the kind of moral clarity that comes from a lifetime of believing that honesty is not optional, that it is the foundation everything else is built on. She wrote up every finding. She organized it by category. She labeled every exhibit. And then she made 3 copies of the complete package, one for the organization's files, one for a safe deposit box at her local bank, and one that she slipped into an old shoebox and tucked under the loose floorboard in the hallway of her house. She had seen enough of this world to know that when powerful people are threatened, documents have a way of disappearing. Renee Matthews was not going to let these documents disappear. She was not done yet. But the clock, though she did not know it, was already running. Now, before we go any further, you have to understand what Renee was walking into. Because what she was about to attempt, reporting financial fraud at an organization with deep roots in the local power structure, is not a simple act of conscience that leads cleanly to justice. It is not a matter of sending one email and watching the right people do the right thing. The history of this country is full of women, and specifically black women, who tried exactly what Renee was about to try, and who paid a price for it that no one ever fully accounted for. Dr. Tommy Savage was a senior contracting officer at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who uncovered widespread government contracting fraud and reported it through the proper internal channels. She was demoted. She was subjected to a hostile work environment. She was handed unmanageable workloads and negative performance reviews she had not earned. She battled through the legal system for years, just to establish her basic right to be heard. Bonatine Greenhouse, the highest-ranking civilian in the entire Army Corps of Engineers, blew the whistle on a $7 billion no-bid government contract and was stripped of her security clearance, demoted, and publicly humiliated by an institution that had spent decades relying on her expertise. These were women with federal employment protections, access to attorneys, and public platforms. And still, the retaliation came fast, hard, and from every direction at once. Renee Matthews had none of those protections. She had a folder, a faith in a system she had spent her career serving, and a community that deserved far better than what had been done to it. She started at the top. She requested a private meeting with the organization's board of directors, specifically the board chair, a local pastor who had been a founding member of the Cornerstone Community Foundation and who had spent 15 years publicly praising Gerald Aldridge as one of the most important figures in the community's history. Renee came to that meeting fully prepared. She submitted a written summary of her findings, organized clearly by category, with supporting documentation attached in labeled exhibits. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. She was thanked politely for her diligence. She was told the matter would be reviewed internally and that the board took these concerns very seriously. And then, nothing. 1 week passed. Then 2. She sent a follow-up email to the board chair. No response. She called his church office. She was told he was unavailable. She left a message. It was never returned. The board, the body of people whose entire legal purpose was oversight and whose responsibility was to safeguard the organization's integrity and the funds it held in trust, had looked at what she brought them and closed the door. She turned next to the state agency responsible for overseeing nonprofits that received public funding. She filed a formal written complaint, attached her full documentation, and sent the package by certified mail so there would be a record of its arrival. The acknowledgement letter that came back was polite and bureaucratic. It confirmed receipt and informed her that the complaint had been assigned to a reviewer. When she finally reached a human being on the phone, after 3 more weeks of waiting, she was told that the review process could take up to 180 days to complete. 180 days. For what she believed was active, ongoing theft from families who were being denied help right now, in real time, while the clock ran down on their ability to keep a roof over their heads. She thanked the person on the phone and hung up. And she sat for a long moment, looking at the wall, letting the full reality of what she was facing settle over her. At that point, Renee Matthews reached out to a journalist, a reporter at the local newspaper who had written several pieces on the nonprofit sector and who had a reputation for taking accountability stories seriously. Renee sent an email with a subject line that was clear and direct. "I have documentation of financial fraud at a major community organization. I am willing to speak on record." She waited. She refreshed her inbox. Nothing came that day. Nothing came the next day. When she followed up by phone several days later, the journalist told her she had never received the email. Renee went straight to her sent folder. The message was there. The timestamp was there. The email had been sent. But according to the journalist, it had never arrived. Not in her inbox, not in her spam folder, nowhere. Renee checked her email account settings that evening for unusual activity. She found a forwarding rule she had not created, directing all outgoing messages containing certain keywords to an address she did not recognize. Someone had been inside her account. Someone had known exactly what she was doing. And someone had made sure that journalist never got the message. Renee put her phone down and sat completely still for a long time. She was beginning to understand, with a cold and clarifying certainty, exactly what she was dealing with. This was not institutional indifference. This was not an overworked agency moving slowly through a backlog. This was a coordinated effort by people who knew what she had found, who had the access and the connections to monitor her communications, and who were prepared to use both to ensure she stayed quiet. Someone in that network had reach. Real reach. The kind of reach that does not stop at the front door of a nonprofit office. She began to change her behavior, quietly, deliberately, the way a person changes when they have understood that someone is watching. She stopped posting on social media entirely. She started taking different routes to work each day, varying her schedule, so there was no predictable pattern to her movements. She grew quieter in staff meetings and more careful about what she said and to whom. She stopped using the organization's shared computer systems for anything she did not want seen. And one evening, she called her eldest daughter, a woman in her late 20s who lived across town, and said something that her daughter did not fully understand until much, much later. "If anything ever happens to me," Renee told her, "look under the floorboard in the hallway, the shoebox. Do not let anyone talk you out of what you find in there. No matter what anyone says about me, no matter what story they try to tell, you look in that box." Her daughter thought it was the stress talking. She told her mother to take some time off, to breathe, to stop carrying so much of the world on her own shoulders. Renee laughed softly at that, the particular laugh of a person who knows something the other person does not. "Baby," she said, "I cannot put this down. I know too much to put it down now. Some things, once you see them, you cannot unsee them. And some things are too important to stay quiet about, no matter what it costs." It was the last real conversation her daughter would remember having with her mother before everything fell apart. On the evening of October 14th, Renee attended what was listed on the organizational calendar as a routine board and senior staff meeting at the Cornerstone Community Foundation. She arrived at 6:47 in the evening, a time confirmed by the building's electronic entry log. Several colleagues later recalled seeing her take her usual seat in the conference room. The meeting ran through standard agenda items, program updates, an upcoming fundraising gala, grant cycle timelines for the coming quarter. Gerald Aldridge was present, as he always was, composed, at ease, working the room with the practiced confidence of a man who had never, as far as anyone watching could tell, lost a single night of sleep over anything. No one reported a confrontation. No one reported anything unusual at all. The meeting ended at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening. Renee said her goodbyes. She picked up her bag. She walked to her car. She drove away. A neighbor later confirmed seeing her car turn into the driveway of her home at approximately 9:35 that night. The porch light was on. The car door opened. And after that, nothing. No lights coming on inside the house. No sound. No movement visible from the street. By the next morning, Renee's daughters had been unable to reach her by phone. By the morning after that, her car was still in the driveway. Her front door was unlocked, and on the kitchen counter sat a coffee mug, half filled, as though she had started making herself a cup and been pulled away from it mid-pour. And Renee Matthews was gone. Her family called the police that same morning. The responding officer took a report, walked through the house, and said the standard things: that most missing persons cases involving adults resolve on their own within 48 hours, that there was no immediate physical evidence of a struggle or forced entry, that they would look into it. What the family did not know, what would not surface until considerably later, was that the officer who took that report had a long-standing personal connection to Gerald Aldridge. They had attended the same church congregation for over a decade. They had appeared together at a neighborhood community event just 6 weeks before Renee disappeared, photographed side by side at exactly the kind of occasion where powerful local men reinforce their relationships and remind everyone present who belongs in the room. Whether that relationship shaped the pace and quality of the initial investigation is something no one has ever officially confirmed. But what Renee's family experienced in those first 72 hours, the weight, the deflections, the sense that the urgency they felt was not being matched by the people they had come to for help, left them with a feeling they could not shake loose. The feeling that the system was not turning for Renee, that she was not being treated as someone whose life mattered enough to move quickly for. And here is where we have to stop and say something plainly, something that anyone familiar with the landscape of missing persons cases in Black America already knows in their bones. According to the Black and Missing Foundation, an organization that has spent nearly 2 decades doing the work that official institutions have consistently failed to do, Black people accounted for 39% of all missing persons in the United States in 2022, while making up roughly 14% of the total population. At the end of that same year, more than 30,000 Black people remained missing. Half of those cases involved Black women and girls, and those cases, on average, received a fraction of the media attention, the investigative resources, and the public urgency given to comparable cases involving white women. The Black and Missing Foundation has measured this disparity with hard data. PBS NewsHour has reported on it. NBC News has covered it. Researchers have studied it for decades, and the families living inside it have felt it not as a statistic, but as a silence, a prolonged, aching, infuriating silence where the sound of justice ought to be. Renee's family knew that silence was coming. They had watched it swallow other stories. They had seen other women surface briefly in local coverage and then fade, the way the women themselves had faded. They were not going to let that happen. Not to their mother, not to their Renee. Within 24 hours of filing the missing persons report, her daughters had organized a search party of more than 60 people, neighbors, church members, former clients of the Cornerstone Foundation who remembered Renee by name, young people she had mentored, elderly residents whose benefit applications she had helped navigate. They printed flyers and posted them everywhere. Telephone poles, laundromats, barber shops, church vestibules, the windows of corner stores across the city. They built a social media page that gathered thousands of followers within the first week. They reached out to every local television station and every newspaper. 2 outlets agreed to run brief mentions. One station sent a camera crew for a segment that aired late in the evening broadcast, well past most people's bedtime. The others did not respond. At the same time, A different kind of story began moving through the community. The quiet, sourceless kind that spreads not through headlines, but through conversations and knowing looks, and the way information travels between people who have something to protect. An anonymous tip began circulating, its origin untraceable, suggesting that Renee had been going through a personal crisis before her disappearance, that she had perhaps made the choice to leave on her own terms. The story had no name attached to it and no evidence of any kind, but it spread efficiently, arriving in people's ears as though it had always been true, and before long, in certain circles, the question had shifted. Not, "Where is Renee Matthews?" but, "Did Renee Matthews have something to hide?" Her family was devastated, but they were not surprised. They recognized exactly what was happening: the recharacterization of the victim, the whisper campaign, designed to drain the urgency out of the story before it could gather enough momentum to threaten anyone. Research by advocates and scholars has documented this pattern in case after case involving missing Black women. The way these women are not only ignored by official systems but actively reframed, labeled as runaways or troubled individuals whose disappearance is somehow a consequence of their own choices. The Black and Missing Foundation has publicly described calling news organizations for months on behalf of missing Black women and being met with complete silence, while cases involving women who looked different dominated every available platform. Renee's family knew they were fighting on two fronts at once, searching for their mother and defending her name at the same time. But Renee had prepared for exactly this. She had known, on some level, that this moment was coming, and she had not left her daughters empty-handed. It was Renee's eldest daughter, a woman we will call Keisha, who went back to the house with real purpose, on the third day after the disappearance was reported. Not just to wait, not just to sit in her mother's kitchen and stare at the half-filled coffee mug that nobody had moved, but to look. She remembered exactly what her mother had told her: the hallway, the floorboard, the shoebox. She found the loose board easily. Her mother had lived in that house for 11 years, and every family member knew which boards shifted under weight. Keisha knelt down in the hallway in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon, the house completely still and the street outside still, and worked the board up with a kitchen knife. And there it was, a worn cardboard shoebox, held together with two rubber bands, sitting in the dark beneath her mother's floor like a message in a bottle, from a woman who had known, when she placed it there, that she might not be the one to open it. Inside that box, Renee had placed everything: printed bank statements with highlighted entries tracing vendor payments to unregistered accounts, internal memos bearing Gerald Aldridge's signature, a detailed, handwritten list, organized in Renee's precise, careful print, names of a city council member who had directed grant funding toward the foundation, a local pastor on the board who had consistently voted to approve the fraudulent budget line items, and a senior official at the very state oversight agency where Renee's formal complaint had been received, and then gone mysteriously quiet. And at the very bottom of the shoebox, wrapped in a rubber band and labeled in red marker, in letters that were calm and deliberate and utterly without panic, was a small USB drive. On that drive were audio recordings. Renee had been recording conversations, covertly and methodically, for months. The recordings captured board meetings in which financial decisions were discussed in terms that left no room for innocent interpretation. They captured internal conversations in which her concerns, raised more than once in staff settings, were dismissed or talked over entirely. And they captured, most damning of all, a private conversation between Renee and a senior figure at the organization in which she was told directly, and without any attempt at subtlety, "You do not want to make enemies in this city. Some things are bigger than you. Let this go." Renee had let nothing go. She had pressed record, held the device steady, and let the man convict himself in his own voice. Keisha did not call the local police. She had already watched what happened when her family turned to the local police. The slow report, the standard deflections, the officer whose personal connection to Gerald Aldridge nobody had thought to mention. Instead, she did what her mother would have done. She made a call. She found a civil rights attorney through a referral from a community legal aid organization. She drove to that attorney's office the following morning with the shoebox on the seat beside her, buckled in as though it were a passenger. Within 48 hours, the contents of that box had been copied and placed in the hands of federal law enforcement. Within 2 weeks, financial accounts associated with Gerald Aldridge and multiple Cornerstone board members had been frozen, pending federal investigation. Within a month, the first arrests had been made. Not by the local police department whose officer had personal ties to the man at the center of the fraud, by federal authorities, because Renee had understood, even before she disappeared, that local systems were not going to deliver justice in this case. She had built her evidence package accordingly. She had known exactly whose hands it needed to reach. Gerald Aldridge was taken into federal custody on a Wednesday morning. He was charged with wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and the misappropriation of federal grant funds. 2 sitting board members were charged alongside him. The consulting firm that had appeared on those fraudulent invoices, the one with no address, no phone number, and no presence anywhere in the state business registry, was traced directly to a close relative of one of those board members. The fictitious vendor accounts had been active and operating for more than 6 years. The total amount confirmed by federal prosecutors as having been diverted from community programs, from housing assistance meant for families on the edge of eviction, from food programs meant for seniors who could not always afford groceries, from youth mentorship meant for children who had no safe place to go after school, came to more than $2.3 million. $2.3 million, taken quietly and deliberately, year after year, from the most vulnerable people in the community, by the man who stood at the podium every single year and told those same people how much he loved them. The community's reaction was layered in ways that are difficult to describe simply. There was shock. Real shock from people who had believed in Gerald Aldridge for a long time and who were now being asked to hold 2 contradictory truths at once. There was anger. There were people who had volunteered for the foundation, donated to it, and recommended it to struggling neighbors, who now had to sit with the fact that their trust had been used as cover for years of deliberate theft. But there was also something else, something quieter and older and harder to name. There was a recognition, spoken carefully in homes and on porches and in the back rooms of churches across that city, that this was not entirely a story without precedent, that the theft of resources from Black communities by people who had positioned themselves as trusted servants of those communities was something that had happened before and would, without real accountability, happen again, that the systems meant to prevent it had failed, that the woman who had finally caught it had been forced to work entirely alone, without institutional support, without protection, at a cost that no one had yet fully reckoned with. At the sentencing hearing for Gerald Aldridge, Keisha Matthews sat in the gallery and did not look away, not when the charges were read aloud in full, not when the prosecutor summarized the evidence, which included audio recordings made in her mother's voice. Not when the judge delivered the sentence. She sat straight-backed and bore witness to every single moment of it, because her mother had always believed that the truth, once brought into the light, deserves witnesses. That showing up matters. That presence is a form of testimony. Her daughter was there to testify. But here is the part of this story that does not end cleanly. Here is the part that will stay with you long after this video is over. Renee Matthews has never been found. Her disappearance is, officially, still an open investigation. The federal case against Aldridge and his associates acknowledged circumstances connected to her disappearance, but no one was ever formally charged in connection with what happened to her. The question of what occurred on the night of October 14th, where she went when she left that driveway, who was involved, what was done, and by whom, remains officially unresolved. Her family does not accept that. They have never accepted it. They continue to speak her name. They continue to submit requests and push at every door that allows itself to be pushed. And they continue to live with the particular kind of grief that does not come from knowing what happened to someone you love, but from not knowing, from waking up every single morning inside a question that has no answer yet, that may never have an answer, and that sits at the breakfast table and rides in the car and follows you to bed every night. And there is one more piece of this story that must be said aloud. On that handwritten list Renee kept in her shoebox, that careful, precise, red marker list she compiled with the same methodical diligence she had brought to every single thing in her professional life. There was one name that was never pursued. One name that appeared in the documentation, that appeared in the audio recordings, that ran as a thread through the entire pattern of obstruction and silence and closed doors surrounding her case from the very beginning. Investigators acknowledged that name. They noted its presence in the evidence, and then they set it aside. The investigation into that name, into what that person knew, and when they knew it, and what choices they made with that knowledge, was quietly closed. The reasons cited in the official record amounted to insufficient evidence to proceed. 6 months after the arrests of Aldridge and his associates, the person attached to that name was appointed to a position of significant influence in the state government. Renee's family has a different word for what happened to that investigation. They have not yet said it publicly, but they have not stopped thinking about it. According to data compiled by the Black and Missing Foundation and reported extensively by PBS NewsHour, NBC News, and Essence magazine, the crisis of missing Black women in America is not a collection of unrelated individual tragedies. It is a pattern, a documented, measurable, stubbornly persistent pattern. Black women and girls represent a profoundly disproportionate share of missing persons cases in this country, cases that receive less media coverage, fewer investigative resources, and less sustained public pressure than comparable cases involving women of other backgrounds. The term missing white woman syndrome, coined by the late journalist Gwen Ifill in 2004, describes a media reality that researchers have confirmed and families have lived inside for decades, a reality that by every available measure has not fundamentally changed. The Black and Missing Foundation was established in 2008, specifically because no other institution was consistently doing this work. Its co-founders, Natalie and Derricka Wilson, have spent nearly 2 decades fighting for coverage, for investigation, and for the simple and radical recognition that these women are not numbers in a database. They are daughters, and mothers, and sisters, and neighbors. Women who brought food to the block party, and stayed late at work, and believed in the communities they served, right up until the moment those communities' institutions failed them. Renee Matthews was one of them. And without something changing, something real and structural and sustained in how this country values the lives of Black women, she will not be the last. So here is what this story leaves us with. A woman who saw something she was not meant to see, who documented it with the same care and precision she had brought to everything in her professional life, who tried every official channel available to her and found each one blocked, slow, or controlled by the very people she was trying to report, who prepared, with extraordinary quiet determination, for the possibility that telling the truth might cost her everything, and who hid the evidence that would eventually bring down an entire operation under the floorboard of her house, in a shoebox, so that her children could finish what she had started if she was no longer there to finish it herself, who disappeared on a Tuesday night and has not been found, and whose work, whose evidence, whose recordings, whose meticulous and loving record-keeping resulted in federal arrests, frozen accounts, and the complete dismantling of an organization that had spent years stealing from the families it claimed to serve. She did not get to see it. She did not get to sit at Sunday dinner with her daughters and say, "I told you so. I kept the receipts and I was right." She did not get to walk out of a courthouse with her head held high and the full knowledge that the truth she protected had won. Whether what she lost was taken from her, or whether she gave it willingly to protect something she believed in more than her own safety, her family does not know. The investigation does not say, but the truth she carried survived her. The documents she prepared were used. The recordings she made were played in open federal court. The list she wrote in red marker and hid under her hallway floor did exactly what she intended it to do. Renee Matthews spent her life believing that if you did right by your community would do right by you. The community she served did not protect her, but her daughters finished what she started. And the truth came out anyway. Now the question belongs to all of us. Not just what happened to Renee, but the larger question underneath that one. How many women, right now, are sitting at a desk late at night, looking at numbers that do not add up, wondering who in the world they can trust with what they have found? How many of them have already knocked on every official door and watched every one of them close? How many of them are taking different routes to work, calling their daughters with instructions, making copies of everything, hoping it will be enough? How many of them are carrying something too heavy to put down and too dangerous to keep holding, with nowhere safe to set it? And what are we, as a community and as a country, prepared to do about it? Not as a policy conversation, not as a statement released and then forgotten, but as people who have just spent the last 30 minutes of their lives being trusted with this story. Renee Matthews is still missing. Her case is still open. Her name deserves to be spoken out loud, in full, without apology. And the question she spent her entire working life trying to answer, who is really serving this community, and who is simply wearing the costume of service while taking everything they can reach, that question has not gone away. It will not go away until the systems that allowed Gerald Aldridge to operate for 6 years, that closed the door on Renee's complaints, that assigned a connected officer to her missing persons report, and that quietly sealed the investigation into that final name on her list. Until those systems are honestly examined and honestly answered for. Was justice really served? One name on that list never saw a courtroom. One investigation was quietly closed. One person accepted a government appointment while a family sat down to every meal with an empty chair. You tell us what you think. Drop it in the comments right now. Tell us where you are watching from tonight. Tell us if this story reminded you of someone. A woman in your community whose story was ignored, whose name faded from the conversation before it ever fully entered it, whose disappearance was met with the particular silence that this country has reserved for women who look like Renee Matthews. Say her name here. This is a space for that. This community of people watching right now is exactly that space, and we will honor every name you leave in the comments below. If this story moved you, if it lit something in you, or confirmed something you have long felt, or reminded you of a truth you have been carrying quietly in your own life, share it, post it, send it to someone who needs to hear it, because some stories survive only because people refuse to stop telling them. Renee kept her receipts. She hid them under her floor and trusted her daughters to find them. The very least we can do is keep her story alive above ground, in the light, where it belongs. If you are not yet subscribed, please do it now. Hit that button and become part of this community. We are glad you are here. Renee Matthews. Say her name.